stunning revelations this morning about the Trump administration's response during the early days of the pandemic. In a new book entitled Nightmare Scenario, Washington Post journalists Yasmin Abu-Tlaib and Damian Paletta report how President Trump suggested sending Americans with COVID-19 to Guantanamo Bay, a place where the U.S. holds terrorism suspects. Joining me now is Dan Diamond, national health reporter at the Washington Post. And Dan, you're here with us because you got an early copy of the book from your colleagues and you read through it. And that business with President Trump wanting to send COVID patients to Gitmo, is that for real?
Well, it's really in the book, and having read it cover to cover, I can tell you there are lots of revelations like that in Nightmare Scenario that really just, even as someone who's covered the pandemic for over a year, it still at times took my breath away.
And explain how that fits in to how President Trump handled the pandemic at that time.
Well, the Guantanamo Bay revelation is set in early 2020 when some U.S. officials were grappling with what to do with infected Americans overseas. John, your viewers might recall that the earliest outbreaks were in China or on cruise ships, and officials wanted to bring those sick Americans home to get them care. What Nightmare Scenario reports is that President Trump had the idea repeatedly that the infected Americans should go to Guantanamo Bay. And this appeared to be less about public health and more about keeping the numbers down on the mainland. The president was worried that numbers of cases here would look bad for his reelection bid.
It's amazing. And he did say it several times, at least according to the book. One other excerpt I want to read here, which is a consistent issue that the president had with testing. He says, quote, "Testing is killing me," Trump reportedly exclaimed in a phone call to then Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar on March 18th, yelling so loudly that Azar's aides overheard every word. Quote, "I'm going to lose the election because of testing. What idiot had the federal government do testing?" Do you mean Jared? Azar responded, citing the president's senior advisor and son-in-law, Jared Kushner. What was the context here?
Well, this was in the middle of March. The nation had already started shutting down. There had been a big Rose Garden event just a few days earlier where private sector leaders showed up with President Trump. There was the talk of Google helping track tests and who might need them. And as a result, testing did start to shoot up. The Google effort didn't really pan out, but more people were able to get tests. The numbers started going up. President Trump, who had said that the virus would go away imminently, was now being proven wrong by the day, looking more foolish as those cases rose. He was looking to take his anger out on someone. He took it out on his health secretary. But in reality, there were lots of people, including the president's son-in-law, who were working to make testing a reality.
You know, this illustrates, I think, what may be one of the larger themes of the book, or at least what I learned from the book from your reporting of it, which is that there was a consistent issue of who was actually in charge. Who was the one actually making things happen? Was it Mike Pence? Was it Deborah Birx? Was it Jared Kushner on testing? It doesn't seem like it was the president of the United States. Talk to us about why this ended up being such a detriment.
Well, I think what ended up happening was President Trump, at times, credit where due, his anger at the bureaucracy was sometimes warranted. President Trump thought the vaccine could be developed in under a year. He was right. But in many cases, his frustration and anger, it just became an obstacle to work around, where President Trump would rail about people needing to be fired, for instance. He wanted to fire the emergency preparedness chief, Robert Kadlec, who helped send those infected Americans back from overseas. He wanted to fire the State Department official who helped with that effort. President Trump's deputies basically just avoided carrying out that order. And obviously, President Trump wanted to fire Tony Fauci, too. That didn't happen. So, John, I think try to imagine putting on a morning show where someone is trying to fire you and Brianna constantly and you're trying to do your job. There's only so much of that that is going to be able to be walled off from what you're trying to do. And I think President Trump just constantly created challenges for his own team, including who was making the final call. Was it Mike Pence of the coronavirus task force? Was it Deborah Birx, the top doctor advising the task force? Was it Alex Azar, the health secretary, who often got overruled early and removed as head of the task force? So what Nightmare Scenario does a great job of doing is exploring the consequences of those decisions that are not made because no one was ultimately willing to make some of the hardest calls.
Meanwhile, Brianna just looks at me and goes, "What does he know? What does he know?"
Well, I am a reporter, but nothing bad about CNN that I've heard.
Dan Diamond, we appreciate your reading and your analysis of this book, which certainly sounds interesting. Thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Happy to talk about my colleagues' good work. Thanks for having me.